So my first question to the entire group is, you're really presenting some new paradigms in how to do research, both in design as well as application. What do you see the challenges for funding, presenting these findings, and really getting them into clinical care? And I'll address that to the entire group.
Is my screen still on? I want to apologize. I'm trying to get it off, or is it off?
Oh, no, you're fine. You're
Okay,
fine.
good.
Go ahead, David.
Yes, you're still sharing your screen, Mona.
Mona, we're seeing lovely pictures of Easter
whoever
eggs.
Easter eggs there are, that's whose screen it is. So I thought that was Jessica's metaphor for how we're going to move forward.
I would like to say that. Sadly, no.
Well,
but I love
it is a good metaphor. There are a lot of different pots of funding. There are a lot of different eggs with different colors of funding. And so it is actually quite apropos of that question. But one of the things that we're going to have to wrestle with as a field is whether we fund large organizational activities in which many principal investigators can participate, or are we still going to continue to fund individual investigators doing, not isolated projects, but relatively centered projects, projects that center on that individual investigator? If we choose the former path, as would be an advocating for large multi-center trials and team science, et cetera, we need to find ways to incentivize and reward the investigators in this field. So if most people do what they're incentivized to do, or at least they should, and so if they're equally incentivized or well incentivized to participate in team science and to participate in multi-center groups, whether it's preclinical technology development or clinical trials, I think we'll see that. Just as a personal example, my uncle was a professor of physics and he worked at CERN in Geneva, and he was part of a team that had thousands of scientists. He never wrote a grant in his life, but he had a very, very successful academic career and made real contributions to the field of physics, which I would argue was a bit more mature than neuroscience or biological sciences as a whole. So I think that's the direction to go. It's going to take a cultural change and everybody's going to have to pull together, but that's my recommendation. Over.
And then if I may, just to build on that, I think that for later phase research, so late phase 2 and phase 3 style research, there's no question that we have to both incentivize working in large teams in these markedly more efficient approaches, but we have to disincentivize continuing with any alternative pathway. And I think there are good examples with StrokeNet, NINDS has done things, NHLBI. There are global clinical trials that show that if you build a trial infrastructure that makes answering your particular question of interest more efficient within that structure than outside of that structure, and make it very difficult to get funding to not pursue that approach, then you can increase the overall efficiency of the entire clinical research enterprise. And I would, it is almost, it would be very difficult for me to picture any rational counter argument to a very strong recommendation that has to be the way forward for that later phase stuff. And then just to build one more thing on David's point, the incentivization within academics is perverse. There's incentives to not be on a team so that you can always be the first author. There are incentives to not terminate a futile trial because then you give up funding, whereas if you can pretend it's still worthwhile to pursue, you can maintain your funding. I mean, there are just a whole string of them. So I think explicitly addressing the incentive system, both within academics and in for-profit settings, and aligning them with the greater societal goal of improving treatments for TBI would be a good thing.
Maybe I'll just follow up very briefly along the themes of I guess, egg dyeing and silos, I guess. I think of the little buckets, that's where I'm going.
think we might be losing Christine again. I'm going to give it one more second.
I'm so
Okay,
sorry.
go ahead.
My
Go ahead.
internet's been bad today. I don't know why. Is this
Go
okay?
ahead. Yes,
Okay.
that's-
Sorry.
You're like in the tech center of the world, Christine. What's going on?
Try
It's
taking off your
raining.
camera. Try taking off your camera.
I will do that. There you go. So, I'm coming at this a little bit from a different place. I really am more of a dementia epidemiologist, and I'm really struck by how my world, which is the Alzheimer's world, just does not really talk to the TBI world. And the NIA hasn't been so much involved in this as well. It's really NINDS. So I think breaking down some of these silos, thinking about how we can cost efficiently assess TBI in the ADRCs, for example. It's not that difficult, and we're trying to get that underway as we speak. So I think that's something we can really do that's very inexpensive, and I do more big cohorts, less trials. So I think it's not that difficult to add the Ohio State or something to a lot of these ongoing studies, and then you could have just rich amount of outcomes, and particularly looking at the life course approach, which is something that I think is very, very important, and again gets siloed by these different investigators and funding sources.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Christine. Before we go to the rest of the committee for questions, I just want to ask Hillary or Mona if they want to respond or have any other perspectives to share.
I'll just echo what David and Roger said, that I think that the disincentivization is really critical. I think that there are more and more toolkits coming out about helping integrate team science into academia and also into APT criteria. But I think there's been national studies that looked at whether or not those were anywhere in APT criteria to actually value team science, even though we say we do, and it's not explicitly there. And so I think that the incentivization needs to happen. So just completely echoing what they're saying.
Yeah, and I would just say that this is happening in all fields. This really is the future of science, I think. And I think actually, oddly, I think TBI is actually a little bit ahead of the field in some ways. So, but I think it is the future.
Somewhere. That's great to hear. Absolutely. So I'm seeing all of the questions starting to come in. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn first to Jeff Manley, who's had his hand raised, I think, the longest. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks very much. So, Christine, you made a couple of good points, and I just want to follow on with this notion of the value of ADRCs. It's been brought up that a similar type of approach where we would have centers of excellence for traumatic brain injury, where patients would be seen and research would be conducted, much in the same way as the ADRCs or the cancer centers. What's your opinion about that in terms of accelerating progress in TBI? And then the question that I would throw out to the rest of the group is, you're correct, is that the NIA has now funded ADNI for the third round. And so they have bought into this big team science.
I think
Department
four.
of Defense.
I think 4.
Yes.
Going on 4.
Yeah, 4. And Cincy and now Limbic. But frankly, I'm not sure that we've seen that coming from NINDS. So I'll just be controversial and throw that out there as well. Over. Thanks.
Yeah, let me, I mean, of course, I love centers of excellence, but I think you could do centers of excellence in a very thoughtful way, where you have both the spokes of the wheel and then the hub. So you could have centers of excellence, some of which focus on dementia, some or the aging patient. Then you could have some that focus on, pediatrics or, et cetera. And then you could all come together. And in that way, also, you're a beautiful setup for doing RCTs, multi-site RCTs, because you've got all of the little groups working together. So I love that idea. I think it hasn't been done enough in all kinds of areas, but so I would definitely applaud that.
We're in the process of working towards that approach in the Department of Defense with the military. Many of the military treatment facilities have Intrepid Centers of Excellence, or the National Intrepid Center of Excellence here in Bethesda, which are very natural sites for multi-center randomized controlled trials in the domain of military traumatic brain injury. The logistics have been daunting of getting that to actually happen, as one can imagine, in the Department of Defense. But the idea is there, and it's very, well thought of. So I think I hope other groups will have an easier time of it than we have been having.
Great. Next, I'm going to go to a question from Monica. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for a wonderful panel. My question has to do with reconciling the notion of centers for excellence with that of providing support to rural and not centers of excellence who care for a large number of patients with TBI. How do we reconcile this need, and what can federal funding agencies do to maybe incorporate or support peripheral centers to be part of the research process?
Go ahead, David.
Monica, that is an absolutely wonderful question, and that's such a critical thing there. It's very well known that rural populations suffer greater disability and poor and worse outcomes from traumatic brain injury than those in urban populations or better served populations, and portions of the developing world even worse than in rural populations. So one of the areas that is of great interest is in the domain of prescription digital therapeutics, which can be provided to traumatic brain injury patients anywhere in the world as long as they have a smartphone and some kind of internet access, which of course I acknowledge is not everyone, but it's a substantially larger fraction of people than live in high resource regions. So obviously not everything can be done by telemedicine. Not everything can be done using prescription digital therapeutics remotely, but a lot of things can. Cognitive behavioral therapy can be delivered very effectively through prescription digital therapeutics, and telemedicine for many cognitive complaints, headache disorders, sleep disorders, mood disorders can often be delivered pretty effectively using remote and telemedicine. So randomized controlled trials of those specific domains in those specific populations would be a strong recommendation to your point exactly. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
Can I just say, so I guess speaking to alignment with incentives, a lot of rural centers or non-trauma centers or non-centers of excellence are, in fact, it's not a goal to do research. It's not a goal to participate in research. They're not incentivized. They don't have the infrastructure. So we can make that recommendation, but is it really, what do we need to do to make that a reality? Because there's the words on a page, and then there's the reality of, our level 2s in Montana or whatever won't be interested, maybe.
So, yeah, I'd like to address that. I actually think that there's a potential trap that one can fall into that inadvertently would cause us more problems with attaining the goal of both efficacy of therapy and equity of access and outcomes. They're rural or otherwise underserved populations, whether they're separated geographically, socioeconomically, based on other sources of differential treatment, are actually doubly penalized. They're penalized both because we don't know a lot about how to treat effectively, and because the things that we do know that work, they have reduced access to. And it is, if one assumes that developing therapies that will be of benefit to those populations requires the research be conducted in those settings initially, you can actually make the research much more difficult to complete, and we can fail to address the very first part of the set of sequential barriers, which is we actually don't have very many good treatments. So I think that one just has to be very thoughtful about how we conduct research in a way that is most efficient so we can get effective treatments, which usually means doing that research in relatively high volume settings. Not always, depending on the digital type of therapy that might be being investigated. And then separately, for those things that are found to be effective, or for which you really have to do the research in a more difficult setting to get a valid answer for that population, how to do that research effectively and how to get the therapies to that population. I just think that it's very easy to actually hobble ourselves if we try to do all of the research everywhere, which I know is not what you intended, but I just think that there's a balance.
Well, I think if the idea is to move towards co-development with community for developing solutions that are applicable and relevant and feasible for them, then us assuming that we can develop solutions in high resource settings, I just wonder if that's a bit presumptuous about the generalizability of what we find.
Yeah, just to address that, I think the one has to be specific about the kinds of interventions. There's a big difference between evaluating a molecule versus evaluating a therapeutic strategy.
Thank you.
And lastly, we're going to go to Mona, and then we're going to go to the next question. Come on. Oh, you're on mute. You're muted. You might have been muted by study staff. Is there a way that?
No, I got it. I'm sorry. So yeah, I think I just wanted to, we're doing kind of a similar thing with schizophrenia research in California and trying to get all the counties in California engaged. And what has been learned from that is, one, of course, you do have to give them some resources. Two, you do need to really nurture a relationship and get their input so that they feel they're part of the process. And three is they have to see value. You have to send them information back. So they're not just seen as another site, another data collection site. They have to see that this is actually going to add value to what they do in the clinic. So it's not like the easiest thing, but it really makes sense when you think about that full engagement, resources, input, and value back to them.
Great, thank you so much. Fred Corley, we're going to go to your question. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jessica. And thanks to the panel. This has been a really tremendous afternoon, and I've learned so much. And my question is for Roger about platform trials. And we spent all afternoon learning about heterogeneity in care, and we know that it's hard to get two neurosurgeons to agree on who needs ICP monitoring, for example. And so I wonder about platform trials in this climate where it's unclear if we're going to have control groups that would apply to the various interventions because the treatment strategies end up being slightly different. So I'm wondering how you think we should best approach that.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I am sure Jessica will not give me the time to answer it completely. When there's tremendous variability that's not evidence-based in the standard of care, one has to think very carefully about the control group. And that really means you have to do patient-level randomization within organizations, because if you do something like cluster randomization, those differences in local patterns become completely confounded with the treatment effect, and you are unlikely to be able to sort it out. You may be able to publish the result, but you may not have the right answer. So I think that one of the characteristics of the design of a platform trial, because of the complexity, is the much, much more tight collaboration, integration, and intellectual exchange between the clinical domain experts and the statisticians. And it is usually during that iterative design process that points like the point you made come out, and the statisticians need to think about, for example, whether or not the control strategies can be separated into several different clusters, and perhaps we evaluate separately against the best performing of the control strategies if they can be characterized with all of the problems that have to do with that observational separation. But I think the general point is you can't run away from the complexity. If the standard of care is heterogeneous, you have to try to measure the characteristics of that standard of care and include that in your inferential models. Now, what you don't want to do is do that separately every time you try to run a trial of, for example, a neurosurgical intervention. You want to do that once within a platform trial and leverage that work as you evaluate a series of hopefully promising interventions.
Go ahead, David.
In my view, I see your point for sure. In my view, platform trials should be just the right size. If they are too big, the heterogeneity can be overwhelming. And if they're too small, you don't gain very much power. So just the right size is hard work to figure it out. But it shouldn't, I mean, a platform doesn't, you don't hold up the entire world on one platform. You have to find a platform that's just the right size. We're not building, this is not Atlas here. This is Baby Bear's porridge. Over.
Great. I guess I would just ask one question before we go into Dawn and maybe to Hillary for this. Thinking about all this randomization, is there an ability also to look at individual factors that may impact some of the efficacy of an intervention? Just throw that out there to Hillary or the group.
I think there is. I think that you need to be collecting those social determinants of health. I think that the fact that we're not necessarily collecting data, looking at or integrating geographic information, geocoding data, and looking at that and leveraging that, I think is a really big gap. And I think that we haven't been thinking about that, especially as we're thinking about longer term outcomes and what are causing or relating to disparities. I think are really big missed opportunities that we're not recognizing, and some of the things that are within the system and the systems that people live in that we need to be addressing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's one of the opportunities sometimes lost by not looking at individualized data and taking more of those approaches, really looking to those demographic and clinical features that might shape different trajectories.
But I think also within the individual, you can also use it rather than looking at the cross-sectional, the trajectories. So I think the trajectory modeling is really the critical aspect of just not the cross-sectional, but then looking at even using it and then looking over time, but where are the trajectories following? What are the characteristics of those within various groups? And so growth-based modeling, other sorts of ways to look at differentiating, but then are there clusters within that could be helpful from a research standpoint? So I think that there are individual factors, but then you can also use that at larger levels.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Next, we're going to turn to Don for his question.
Thanks a lot. Roger, can I just ask you to go back to basics just a little bit more, which is like, what do you mean by a platform trial? And
Sure.
And then related to that can that approach be international? Would you recommend this committee consider international research consortiums, or is there plenty to do just in this country alone?
Sure. So a platform trial is sometimes called a master protocol, but the terms are really different. The term master protocol is a way of managing the complexity of a trial that may have multiple populations, different treatments, different inferential questions being asked. It is an operational consistency to increase efficiency. A platform trial is a master protocol that includes randomization across multiple therapeutic domains. So for example, in the setting of TBI, you might have some initial management strategies, whether they're airway management, imaging strategy, neurosurgical standards of care, particular drugs, molecules, and the patient who meets the criteria for any one or more of those therapeutic options would be randomized simultaneously across all of those therapeutic domains or strategies. So you may have literally thousands of possible combinations of therapies. And you have an approach where you make frequent interim analyses and modify the randomization proportions to emphasize the treatment arms and combinations that appear to be most promising to improve the overall benefit proposition for patients enrolled in the trial over time. Then at the interim analyses, you assess whether or not any one of the therapeutic approaches is statistically better than the others with sufficient certainty to be able to draw what we call a platform conclusion. So for example, to use COVID as an example, since it's very near and dear to my heart, we may be evaluating anticoagulation strategies and not know which is best, but know that one is worst, in which case that will be dropped from the randomization moving forward. We may be able to identify a strategy that is better than the others, and then that becomes the standard of care moving forward and a publication comes out. These platform trials that have been effective are often, if not the majority of the time, international in scope. The REMAP CAP trial that I'm affiliated with in COVID has several hundred sites across countries in Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, and Europe. So they tend to be international. That obviously improves the generalizability of the results, both in patient populations and the different configurations of the care systems in which patients are treated. So I think the staff will be able to pull a few articles on this. There was a very short JAMA tutorial, 2 pages we wrote on this. That's probably a good place to start. And then there's a wonderful review article by Janet Woodcock and Lissa Lavange at the FDA that was in the New England Journal in 2017 that sort of builds on this. But multiple therapies with the available therapies changing over time without any pause in enrollment or outcome assessment is the fundamental principle.
Thanks. Can I follow up with just a quick question, Jessica? So David Brody's case for Bayesian adaptive designs is totally consistent within the platform design you're talking about. It's a way to make those adaptive.
Yeah, we were saying exactly the same thing, but using different words. Hopefully David agrees with that.
Yep,
so
absolutely.
One of the key opportunities, there's 2 pieces of the inferential efficiency that are really the key to the recent successes. One is response adaptive randomization, where, as I mentioned, the randomization proportions are modified to get patients to the most promising therapies before you know for sure which one is actually best. That's done using Bayesian modeling. It doesn't have to be done that way, but it's the more efficient way, and it's essentially become the standard across recent platform trials. So that is one of the adaptations that's built into these trial designs.
And do you see real world evidence approaches as potentially feeder of hypotheses to a platform design, or do you think that they need to be regarded as not particularly useful?
So I think
in the
that
TBI setting.
Sure, and I think that all of the available approaches for generating hypotheses are still come into play. Real world evidence is a huge source of hypothesis generation. My admonition regarding focusing on real world evidence is when people try to make causal inference in a complex disease setting based on real world evidence, as there are so many examples in which we have been misled. So for hypothesis generation, I think it's absolutely critical. I will just briefly comment that there's the term REMAP stands for Randomized Embedded Multifactorial Adaptive Platform. It was a term coined by Derek Angus at Pittsburgh. And it has the embedded word implies the use of EHR and real world data to feed much of the information used in the trial to increase the operational efficiency of the trial. So there's real world evidence for hypothesis generation to make sure we're asking the right questions to the extent possible. And then there's the use of real world evidence actually within the trials to decrease the research-related burden and make them more efficient.
Great, thank you so much, Roger and David. The last question we'll have is from Susan. Go ahead.
So my quick question for all of you is about the efficiency of the launch. In other words, is there a trial that we can join or that can easily be switched to be, is an international, which is what sort of a flexible trial, I'm not going to use the word adapted, that is perfect for TBI to join? And if not, is there one that's a best practice model because getting one of these international relationships going takes a ton of work and a lot of jockeying for who's the lead and who should be on the governing. So how can we get more efficiently to an international collaboration to move as quickly as possible in these sort of flexible designs?
So I'm actually not an expert on this, but I do think that the siren model that NIH stood up several years ago is kind of an example of that. So they do have sites in place, and then they can run multiple studies in parallel because different sites will be on certain other ones. So it kind of can, depend who's got either that right patient caseload or they have the capacity. So I think that's one example. But a lot of the infrastructure is already kind of laid down, so you don't have to renegotiate every agreement every time.
And just to be clear, siren is US only?
I think so. I don't,
Yeah.
maybe someone, yeah, okay.
Yeah, Siren is the joint NINDS NHLBI Emergency Care Research Network. So I think it's a great question. I think I'm going to try to parse it out really quickly. So you sort of alluded to cultural factors that make the management of all the humans involved and the egos and the priorities manageable. There are some successful examples of negotiating that both within the international community and the US. And I think the best thing to do is to actually talk to some of the people who've lived through that, because they can tell you what has worked and then the horror stories about what didn't work, which are probably as valuable. The REMAP CAP collaboration, the EPAD collaboration, GBM Agile. So I'm trying to use things in neurology. Those are all great examples. In terms of the funding structure, the key point is getting the first part of the platform built so that the cost of entry of the next question, population, or outcome is lower in the platform than outside of the platform. And that really usually requires a federal level initial funder. It can be done with a collaboration of for-profit sponsors. My impression is that is harder. And I think the StrokeNet within NINDS, and I believe there's a current solicitation that's related to this, may provide an example of a way that a US federal funder might be able to do that. Our experience in a number of disease areas is once you get the first plank of the platform built, and it becomes a good value proposition to answer questions within the platform rather than to try to do it on your own. Then if there's research activity in that area, whether it's federally funded or from commercial biopharmaceutical device manufacturers, that sort of thing, there suddenly is a lot of interest in joining the platform. And there's a critical mass that you get over, and then you have more people interested than the logistical complexity can handle. And you want to get to that point. The challenge, I think, from just a human behavior point of view, and I'm certainly not a behavioralist, is that today, the fastest way to answer one question you can get funded is to do your own trial. But if we keep always taking the fastest route to getting each trial started, we will severely restrict our progress as a field over the next 10 years.
Thank you.
It's a bit like the old marshmallow problem, where you can have one marshmallow now, or you can have two marshmallows if you're willing to wait 20 minutes. The ability to make short-term sacrifices to achieve long-term gains. It's definitely more expensive and harder work to set these things up, but the long-term reward pays off over.
And there's no easy solution to this, but someone earlier today mentioned sort of the importance of leadership, and that is actually essential. And sometimes they just emerge and rise on their own, or whatever we can do to build leadership. I mean, we have some really good leaders, which I think has helped to really get us the field this far, but it is really critical, and especially on these international relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. With more of a long-term view, I think that's essential. Absolutely. With that, we're going to go ahead and close, and I'm going to send it back over to Dawn to do the wrap up for today. So thank you so much to the panel. This was extremely valuable to us. So thank you so much for your time, your expertise. We really value it. Thank you so much.